Hello and greetings today. Welcome to this very exciting webinar. We've been looking forward to this for quite some time now. As here at Real Story Group, we're going to be walking you through the right AI vendors for your MarTech stack. It's an exciting day for us as we just published research on this topic today, and my colleagues Tony Byrne and Apoorv Durga will dive deep into that for you and give you a sense of what we discovered when putting together that research and some of the vendors that we're covering in that space. So looking forward to presenting that to you today. In the meantime, I did want to let you know that we will have time at the end for questions. So if you have any questions or feedback that you'd like to share, you're welcome to enter that into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. The slides from this presentation will be available later this week. And for our subscribers on the line, there will be a recording available for you in your subscriber library as well. So welcome everyone, and I see a lot of new names in our list here, so thanks for joining us today. And for those of you that are new to Real Story Group, we've been at this for 22 years now, and you know, when Tony started this company, he likes to tell the story of how he was more out of frustration than anything else with your so-called traditional analyst reports, as they weren't really matching the experience he was having with, at that time, web content management technology. So he wanted to start a firm along the lines of like a Consumer Reports, where really we tell you what these vendors are good at, but maybe more importantly, what they're not so good at. So we never consult for the vendors or advise them on their strategy in any way. So you can be confident that, again, you're getting the real story about these vendors and which ones are going to be the right fits for what it is that you're trying to do. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Tony and Apoorv to take us through the heart of today's presentation, guys.
Great, thanks. Really good to see everyone. My colleague Apoorv is here. He's led the research on this new stream, AI for marketing, and it represents a new line on our subway map where we show all the different vendors that we evaluate. And super excited whenever we can add a new line to this map. This is one way, of course, of visualizing, one way out of many different ways of visualizing the marketing technology space. This kind of shows some of the intersections among which vendors cover which sorts of technologies. And AI, of course, you've got big players as well as point players. And so to that extent, it is like other MarTech spaces, and we can evaluate these vendors the way we evaluate other MarTech stack vendors, but AI is also somewhat unique as a phenomenon and as a technology, and you have to also sort of treat it a little bit differently, and it has a particular type of role in your stack going forward. So we'll talk about that as well. So just about the new research that we're just releasing today. We evaluate 20 vendors across 3 categories. I'll show you in a minute what those 3 categories are. And then 8 business use cases that also span 3 different categories. So if you know Real Story Group, you know that we don't evaluate vendors on a sort of feature by feature basis, but rather what are the different business use cases that they support? How intensively and effectively do they support them? So this research is 4+ months in the making. We're updating it constantly, as you can imagine, just updated bits of it this morning. And so these are also hard-hitting assessments, so you won't see any cheerleading here from Real Story Group. We only work on your side of the table for enterprise buyers, and so we have some things to say about this technology. This is also very much leavened by our experience with the Real Story Group MarTech Leadership Council. So these are enterprise MarTech leaders from large enterprises. I'll have more to say about that in a few moments, but they helped shape this research, guide it, got a sneak preview, helped direct us in some useful directions, and some of what we'll have to say here is based on their learnings that they've shared with us. So we always like to start with talking about any marketing technology in the context of your MarTech stack, because your MarTech stack is, of course, where it all begins and ends. And most of you who know us have seen this reference model. This is a B2C reference model. There's another similar one for B2B, where this is a kind of a to-be generic vision of what we think the 2020s, the rest of the 2020s will look like, where you have At the very top, a proliferating number of engagement channels. Beneath that, some interaction delivery environments, and then some engagement services. And we've been spending a lot of the previous decade really bulking up our engagement services. The problem is that then led to a lot of silos of experience. And so we've seen the evolution over the past 3 years of what we call enterprise foundation services, which cluster sort of into 3 legs of the stool here: content and information on the left, data services in the middle, and decisioning services on the right. And these are foundation services that are decoupled from particular engagement environments. So nominally, you can apply them across your environments in a truly omni-channel, more customer-centric way. Sometimes we call this architecture legless to contrast it with like a headless architecture. So AI kind of challenges this architecture in not necessarily a bad way, but not always in a good way either, in as much as you see vendors injecting AI services into nearly every layer of this stack. And so I'm going to guess that 90% of the MarTech vendors that you work with now have some AI capabilities that they're exposing in their interface. Now, some of these could be warmed over algorithms that they already had. In other cases, they're OEMing some AI capability. In other cases, they've built something perhaps based off an open source base and sort of hastily injected it into their platform. But the reality is that if you have an email marketing platform or you have a web content management system, chances are today there's a little button that you can say, improve this article or write a new article based on this feed, this feed, and give it a particular tone. And so that has the benefit of convenience, and some of you are leveraging these services at a local level. It has the problem of potentially not of being yet another silo, so you lose some omni-channel coherence and you lose some enterprise governance as well. And also, I think it behooves you to really understand what's the provenance of these capabilities. And so what this has led us to believe is that in going forward for the smart enterprises, AI is going to be a layer in your stack. So this may not be for everyone, and it may play out differently in different cases, but we think of AI as kind of an enterprise foundation service. So we've added this to our stack model here, where you've got generative AI, insights AI, and decisioning AI. All of these with a role, ideally all of these working coherently across your different silos. That's not necessarily the case today, but we think that particularly for larger enterprises, this is where the market is going to want to go, if only because of the particular needs around enterprise governance that AI really compels us all to do. And so what that means is that, there's a set of AI vendors that are out there, and some are really more of an application, others are more of a service, some are omni-channel, some are not. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is sort of the reference model of where we see AI headed in the future. Of course, reference models are generic and aspirational. The real world is always a little bit messier than this. You'll see bits of AI all over the place, but our sense is, and certainly based on the input we've gotten from our council, that you're going to want to try to wrestle this at more of an enterprise level, or at least at a MarTech stack level. So our subscribers have been talking to us about this. We've learned a lot of really interesting lessons. We can't share everything that's come out, particularly from our council, because it's confidential, but there are some, what I would describe as initial observations that are worth sharing now before we start talking about the vendors. And so there's still a little bit of a tension between enterprise strategy and approach versus departmental and channel specific initiatives. Certainly the former offers more risk mitigation, the latter offers you potentially more speed and adaptivity. And then of course, you may not even have a choice here in as much as where is AI showing up? Are you working with a more channel neutral infrastructure vendor partner, or something that was randomly injected into this SaaS service that you're licensing? One thing that we believe is a trend based on the input that we're getting is a desire to have an enterprise strategy and approach that involves a lot of training, education, guardrails, security, and compliance, as well as cost control. Right now, the major energy is around generative AI. There's a perception, largely accurate, that it's much more accessible and more pluggable than other forms of AI. That's true. I think in the long run, there's still an open question about whether generative is really where all the gems are here. And so we'll talk about that in a minute. But the bottom line that we've seen is a great diversity of use case explorations. And so we've shared a list of those. It's nearly 24 among our councils of different pilot programs that they have going on. What's interesting about it, though, is that most of these still are pilots, sort of pending broader rollout. And before there's a broader rollout, organizations are taking a harder look at cost and to that extent ROI. The other thing that we've learned is that full optimization cycles really need all three types of AI, both generative, insights, and predictive, kind of working together. If you have just generative AI on its own, how do you know whether it's working well, and how do you know that it's generating the right message for the right individuals? And so there's something here around more closed loop AI that we'll talk about in a minute, and it has particularly profound implications with respect to the marketplace. So let's talk about the market. So this is maybe what you came here to get, and let's just jump right into it. AI vendors for MarTech. As usual, there are many ways to slice and dice a marketplace. Ideally, this would be a three-dimensional model, but we are in a two-dimensional screen here, and so let's just lay it out like this, which is there are a large number of generative specialists. Those vendors are now, as you know, under some degree of stress. Many of them have a fair bit of cash to sort of weather this stress. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in this market. But the reality is that across the different generative use cases, you do have a lot of choices. Then you see traditional MarTech vendors like Adobe and Salesforce. And they have more multifunctional AI capabilities, but are suite dependent. In other words, these capabilities only show up within their suites. There's some significant differences architecturally in the way that Adobe does this from the way Salesforce does this. Our research goes into more detail, but these are basically injecting AI into their suites. Kind of a more interesting and complicated story going on at Microsoft, IBM, and AWS, where again, multifunction capabilities for AI, but very much dependent on the underlying infrastructure and very much an extension of the custom work that you might already be doing in Azure, in the IBM cloud, in AWS. And this has a lot of, on the one hand, feels attractive, but has a lot of significant implications for marketers. And we'll talk about that in a minute as well. But for today, these are the three categories that we're coming out with. This may evolve over time, but I think it's safe to say that a robust marketplace has emerged. Whether which vendors are the right fit for you or not is kind of a more interesting question. So I mentioned earlier that no single vendor spans all these use cases very well. And so I wanted to just illustrate this using one of Real Story Group's decision tools, which is called Real Quadrant. So this is an alternative to the Magic Quadrant that drove me to the ridiculousness of the Magic Quadrant is, as Scott mentioned, what drove me to found Real Story Group 22 years ago. And so as an alternative, we've developed something called a Real Quadrant, where you put in the scenarios that are critical to you, and those are the x-axis, and then what are the strategic considerations that are important to you, and how would you weight those, and those constitute the y-axis. So what I did here was just use our Real Quadrant generator, and you can go to our website under the tools and do this yourself anytime, and just put in, I think I listed 6 of the potentially 8 major scenarios or use cases that we use to evaluate AI vendors. And we said, look, what if I wanted all 6 of these things? And Apoorv is going to describe what these are and what the 8 are in a minute. But I'm trying to make a broader point here that if I have a pretty wide remit for AI and then I generate a quadrant out of this, yeah, a lot of vendors show up, but nobody's in the upper right winners quadrant. There's a selection of vendors in the upper left, kind of a consolation prize, and then quite a few in the lower left loser quadrant. And so what this tells us is that across the vendor landscape, you can't really find a single vendor that's really excelling or even offering across the whole panoply of different AI capabilities. And so what this means, if you're a large enterprise, you may have to make some tough choices about potentially deploying different AI platforms for different use cases. And so if you're a MarTech veteran with a composable stack, this probably is no surprise to you. So we see IBM in the middle there. We're going to talk about IBM in a second as just an example of actually a prototypical sort of enterprise vendor. What are they doing with respect to AI and MarTech? So here I'm going to turn it over to Apoorv to just dig into IBM's Watson X. What did we find about it, and what does this mean for the marketplace as a whole? So Apoorv, go ahead and take over here.
Great. Thank you, Tony. So here's an example to illustrate how we evaluate different vendors. In this case, this is IBM Watson X. Typically, and this is across all our streams, we have a vendor at glance section that provides a summary which really includes strengths and weaknesses and some other things. In fact, we actually focus more on weaknesses because we think vendor marketing does a good job of talking about strengths. We then compare vendors using scenarios for that particular stream. Uh, Tony mentioned 6 scenarios, and we will look at 8 scenarios that are there for this stream. And then we compare using what we call strategic factors, which aren't really functional in nature, but are more related to vendor intangibles. We'll see an example here. So let's start with the strengths and weaknesses of Watson X. Now, as you know, Watson is IBM's long-standing AI platform. The current edition is called Watson X, and it provides capabilities for generative AI and what IBM calls traditional AI. Now, IBM's Watson X provides a broad range of generative and traditional AI capabilities, but the focus is really on enterprise AI use cases and not specific to marketing. And that's what is reflected in the strengths and weaknesses. Right. So let's look at the strengths first. Like I mentioned, it is one of the few platforms that provides capabilities across the spectrum. So it provides capabilities for generative as well as decisioning services via a single platform, which is important. The second strength here is that it is an independent layer which is decoupled from enterprise stacks. Now, I think that's very important capability if you have a very heterogeneous stack and you want a consistent set of AI capabilities appearing in each of the components of your stack. So that becomes an important strength. And because of that, you can readily access underlying data from stores from stores in other clouds such as AWS or S3, etc. So it's not just limited to IBM's own clouds. IBM also provides an IP indemnity, which means that if should something go wrong, specifically for their foundational model, IBM will come to your rescue. There are free tiers available, so you can try and evaluate before you actually commit to IBM's offerings. And finally, the underlying tool set is really a broader data science and ML ops platform. So you can use it for use cases which are beyond marketing. So things like anomaly detection or fraud detection or customer service or other non-marketing use cases. Let's look at the weaknesses next. The first one is that there are no marketing related capabilities out of the box. Right now, IBM has had traditional strengths in knowledge management and search, etc., and that's what IBM plays on. There are libraries and APIs and models, etc., using which you can build MarTech capabilities or build MarTech features or address MarTech related use cases, but there are no out of the box capabilities. It is a developer tool, which means that there are no business friendly interfaces. You will have to roll up your sleeves or have your developers work and build solutions for your needs. We said that it is stack independent, and that's a strength, but even then you will still need to spend considerable amount of time in integrations to be able to obtain any reasonable value from this platform. So it is very integration and developer heavy platform. Again, we said that it can run on other clouds or access data from other clouds, but the fact is that you will end up using a lot of services from IBM Cloud, and for getting the best bang for your buck, it may make sense to run it off the IBM Cloud and not other clouds. Finally, IBM's track record with marketing specific technologies has been weak, right? They sold off their earlier MarTech offerings and spun off a separate company called Acoustics, and so sold some to HCL. So their track record is not very encouraging. Okay, so let's look at the next aspect that Tony, you were saying something?
Nope. Go ahead.
Sorry. So the next aspect is that we tackle in our reviews is comparison using business use cases or scenarios. Now we have separate scenarios for each of the work streams, and for AI we came up with these eight use cases or scenarios. They have been categorized into three heads. The first is the generative AI, which is essentially related to the ability to generate text or images or media, etc. Right. So there are four scenarios there. The first one is the text generation, which is really the central capability of generative AI. Then there is text personalization, which is the ability to personalize the text that you have generated. Now you could personalize based on user, etc., or you could also personalize your text based on your tonality or your branding and things like that. Image generation and media generation, fairly self-explanatory. Just like text generation, instead of text you are generating images or audio and video here. Then you have the insights AI, which is there is one scenario there called advanced intelligence, essentially using AI powered analytics to deliver insights and intelligence. And then you have the decisioning AI, which has three scenarios. There's predictive next action and personalization, which is about creating more customized experiences and options based on customer profiles. So predicting what the next action would be, or recommending a product based on some parameter. Then you have the behavioral recommendations, which is basically generating recommendations based on customer behavior across channels. And then you have e-commerce recommendation, essentially a subset of behavioral recommendation, but focused specifically to e-commerce use cases.
Yeah.
Now you will see that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so you can read you can see the ratings that we give, and you can read the scores here. I think the interesting story about IBM here is that they have broad set of capabilities, but not particularly deep at any one. What IBM would retort and come back and say, well, you could go very, very deep if you throw enough developers and money and time at it, which technically is true. watsonx is really a development environment, or more of a toolkit. And unfortunately, that toolkit is not yet really geared to marketing, but time will tell whether IBM evolves in a different way. So that's just a kind of a quick view. Thank you, Apoorv, for kind of showing the structure of the research related to just one particular vendor. Well, we're running a little short on time. Wanted to also point out their strategic considerations here as well. Remember, that was the y-axis. You can, again, read this on your own. You'll get a copy. Here's where IBM is a little bit stronger. And so with respect to the resources that they can bring and the longevity that they have been working on in this space, the one thing we'll point out at the bottom here, Apoorv, we give them a pretty low score for value for money. And why is that?
The key reason is that it takes a lot of effort to build anything there, right? And if you were to put monetary value to that, that would be huge, right? So yeah, even for doing basic things, there's a lot of integration, a lot of developer work, and so on.
So this is the classic pitfall of toolkits, of course, is that in theory you can build anything, but the amount of resources that you need to build and then sustain and support something very specific to your needs can be prohibitive in some cases. So I mentioned earlier a lot of really interesting conversations from some of our more sophisticated subscribers about closing the AI loop, where generative AI leads to demands for more insights AI around what's working, and then decisioning AI around who should be getting what, where, and when, and then that driving particular requirements around generative and so on and so forth. And so this is where we think that the industry is going. At least this is where customers are going, more savvy customers are going. But this does require enterprise integration. It's likely going to be multiple vendors for reasons that Apoorv has made plain. And then obviously, of course, enterprise governance coming up again with respect to not just guardrails, but how can we manage the flow of data and intelligence across these three somewhat different capabilities, even if they're all AI powered. So some final takeaways, you can read this on your own, but just to summarize, certainly a marketplace is emerging here, characterized by quite an exceptional variety in terms of approaches, which means that you will not be able to really have a single vendor that can take you across that entire closed loop. Cost and integration are emerging as key mitigators here going forward among some of your savvier, more advanced peers. And so that's all the more reason why you want to evaluate vendors very closely, based not on some generic quadrant, but based on your specific scenarios. And of course, we wouldn't be Real Story Group if we didn't say you should always try before you buy. So this is a fairly tall order, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that RSG can certainly help you in these efforts. There's three different things that we can do, or three different ways that you can avail yourself of our services. First is you can simply license our AI research and advisory services, get access to that full quadrant generator, get access to us to help you understand which vendor or vendors might be a good fit for you. The second way that some larger enterprises work with us is to optimize their entire stack, so they get a full stack subscription, and we help them figure out how the different pieces then fit together. And then, as I mentioned, there's a subset of those who join our Real Story Group Council, where we have private meetings with no vendors, no consultants, where you can really let your hair down and share your problems and victories with your peers and learn from each other. We're actually having our next virtual council meeting tomorrow. We're going to pick up on the AI discussion that we've been having both virtually and in person really all year. And so a big part of that conversation tomorrow is going to be on AI. We're also going to be talking about emerging organizational models. So it's a great place for MarTech leaders, enterprise MarTech leaders, to convene and share. Just wanted to remind you again, if you had any questions, we'll have a few minutes for those. You can go ahead and put them into the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. In the meantime, Scott, you want to just, while we look at the questions, you want to just talk about next steps?
Absolutely. And so for our subscribers on the line, if you already have an account with Real Story Group and you'd like to see this AI research added to your account, certainly reach out to us and we can talk through that with us, with you. And for folks that don't yet have a subscription but are interested in this research, we certainly would encourage you to download a sample from the AI stream and any of the other areas that we cover to get a sense of how we evaluate each of these solutions. And I'd be happy to walk you through the tools that Tony showed you in a little more detail and how you can create custom vendor shortlists and compare those vendors side by side with each other. In terms of next steps, we do have another webinar next week. If you or any of your colleagues are thinking about selecting CDP in the coming year, we'll be diving deep into the world of customer data platforms. So certainly welcome you to join us next Wednesday at the same time. And with that, I do see at least a couple of questions that have emerged in the questions tab. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Also wanted to mention, if you are a full stack subscriber on the call, you already should be able to access the AI research if you log in today immediately. So it's released and available to you. So Stefan is asking a good question. Cost emerging as an issue. We mentioned this a couple times. Could we explain that a bit? Sure, Stefan. I think I'll take a stab at this, and Apoorv, maybe you've got something to overlay, but you know, AI is very compute intensive, and we know that compute is emerging as one of the great and complicated and sometimes heavy marginal costs that the vendors themselves endure. And so very often they try to figure out variable ways of passing along that marginal cost to their licensees. And AI being very compute intensive, this is an issue. You can't just get an enterprise license for a generative platform and let everyone loose, because you are likely, almost surely, going to pay based on the volume that you're using it. And so this has companies that have really spent some time with this and have kind of gone through different cycles asking themselves hard questions about return on investment. Similar cycles going on the insights in the machine learning side, where again can be very compute intensive. And there's issues around real time versus near real time versus offline computing as well that factor into this. But cost is definitely emerging as an issue here, as it does in all other MarTech, except that once again AI seems to be very compute intensive, and that has some specific implications. Apoorv, anything to add on top of that?
Yeah, I think some of the companies who've tried building their own LLMs from scratch, they have realized that it is exorbitantly expensive to do that, right? So
yeah. So Mariella is asking Apoorv that we saw Google under generative, but not under the infrastructure vendors. So what's going on there?
Google under generative, but not infrastructure vendors. Yeah, so Google has been really pushing their generative AI technologies more than their other technologies, right? So sure, you can build decisioning services or insight services using their libraries and platforms, etc. But it's not really productized, not yet at least, right? So whereas their Bard and Palm and other Vertex AI are really more productized solutions.
Yeah. So it's even, I guess, even more of a toolkit than IBM at some level. They haven't quite yet rolled out the equivalent of Watson X. Okay, great. Well, we've run a couple minutes late. Thank you all for sticking around. Always great to spend time with you, and looking forward to seeing you again. For Scott and Apoorv, this is Tony and the rest of the RSG gang signing off for now. Bye now.